Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Before we begin, can I just check that everybody can hear and see me? A simple nod of the head will suffice. Lovely, thank you, that's helpful. Well, it's now 9:30 and it's time for me to resume this hearing session on Matter 6 site allocations with particular reference to the strategic allocation at Ipswich Garden Suburb. Before we begin, could I just please remind you to make sure that your mobile phones are switched off or that they're on silent while the hearing is in session? And also, could I ask you please to ensure that your microphone is muted until you are invited to speak, so that we can avoid any disturbance from any background noise or feedback from microphones on computers. I would also like to just remind participants that where there is more than one participant per representor, that you just have one person who is speaking or intending to speak with their camera switched on, please, just to try and save our bandwidth. Obviously, the exception to this is the council, who has their barrister present. I'm happy for you to keep your camera on clearly, and also just one representative from the council if we can, please. The hearing session is being live streamed today, as well as being recorded by the council and published shortly afterwards on the council's YouTube channel, with a link from the examination website for interested parties to view. In terms of timings today, this hearing session is programmed to finish no later than 1. However, there may need to be some flexibility on that, and we will have a comfort break between 11 and 11:30 if required. Before we resume our discussion, there is a matter which I would like to raise. Now, in response to a supplementary question that I asked at the earlier session on the Ipswich Garden Suburb on the 26th of November, relating to discrepancies alleged by SOCS and NFPG between the trigger points for road junction improvements in the planning applications for the Ipswich Garden Suburb and the indicative phasing for the IGS assumed in the topic paper I6 and the ISPA transport modelling, the County Council and WSP have produced a note. Now, we have asked Annette to send this document to SOCS and NFPG following this hearing session, inviting you to make comments on it if you wish. Details of the appropriate length of any response and the timing for its submission will be confirmed by Annette by email. Now, this document will also then be placed on the examination website along with any responses to it. And just for clarification, it's not our intention to discuss this document at today's session, but clearly we will have regard to any comments that are made on it by any interested parties. So without further ado, could I just ask participants for this morning's session to introduce themselves, please? Perhaps I could start with the councillor. Ms Tuffor, could I ask you to introduce your representatives, please, today?
I will do. Thank you. Good morning, Madam. My name is Isabella Tuffor, and I'm a barrister providing legal advice to the Borough Council. And with me today are Lisa Evans from the Council and Carlos Hone, who you've heard from before. Also Stuart Cook from Aspinall Verdi and Andy Talbot from WSP, to the extent that you may wish to hear from them.
Thank you very much. Do we have a Mr. Coleman here from Mersey Homes as well? Perhaps you'd like to just say good morning. Mr. Coleman, I can see you now on my screen. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name's Kevin Coleman. I'm from Phase 2 Planning, and yes, we're representing Mersey Homes in relation to the Red House Farm neighbourhood.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Samuel. Perhaps you'd like to just introduce yourself to the meeting as well, please.
Good morning, Brian Samuel, Northern Fringe Protection Group. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Edwards.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Edwards, representing Skinner Salter Partnership in relation to a viability matter that's, we say, a flaw that runs through the entire whole plan viability appraisal.
Thank you. And Mr. Cutting, on behalf of the County Council. Good morning to you.
Good morning, I'm James Cutting, Head of Planning at Suffolk County Council. I'm supported by Luke Barber on any transport matters today.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mrs. Robinson, are you able to hear and see us? No, okay. Well, we did. I was told by the programme officer before we started today that Mrs. Robinson is having some difficulties connecting to the hearing session. So what I've suggested to the programme officer is that Mrs. Robinson listens to the session either on YouTube or as she potentially is in the session herself this morning. And then at the end of the session, or towards the end of the session, I will come to her and ask her if she has any comments that she would like to make on anything that she's heard. Now, I'm hoping that she will be able to do that by phone, but I will give her a couple of minutes notice before the end of the hearing session so that she can join us, because I understand there is a slight delay in terms of the YouTube live stream. So I will intend to do that towards the end. So hopefully, Mrs. Robinson, if you can hear me, and if you have any comments later on, if you would like to join us by telephone to convey those comments to us, we would appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so if we can move on then to the amended agenda, which you should all have been sent a copy of. And this is in terms of the strategic allocation, as I said, Ipswich Garden Suburb, and the remaining areas for discussion. So firstly, healthcare provision, which relates to question 80 in our MIQs. Now, I had no further questions, and I just wondered if anyone else had anything to say on this before we move on. I appreciate, before we adjourned, I think Mr. Coleman, you said you might have something you wanted to add in terms of healthcare provision. Is that still the case? Sorry, it's a very long time ago, you've probably forgotten.
Yes, it wasn't healthcare, it was the SPD question 82.
Apologies, my mistake, but we'll come on to that in a moment, so that's absolutely fine. Are there any other questions in relation to healthcare provision? No, lovely. Can I move on then to open space provision and the requirement for recreation avoidance and mitigation strategy? And this relates to question 81 in our MIQs. And I just have a further follow-up question really to Mr. Samuel, perhaps if I could direct this question to you. And why do you consider that the approach to securing a contribution towards the recreation avoidance and mitigation strategy, otherwise known as RAMS, should be referenced in policy CS10 and table 8B?
Thank you. Yeah, in relation to RAMS, I admit we're a bit confused about it really, because we know that there is we've now found out that there is a sum of £7,500 for the Crest and the CBRE sites, Henley and Fonarow. But we were led to believe, that in the relevant SPD, that there'd be a sum would be for sort of infrastructure projects to help offset the increased number of visitors to the Orwell Country Park. However, it appears that the sum is for monitoring in the case of one of the sites and for additional resource for the IBC rangers at the country park to monitor visitor behaviour. What we're concerned about is whether this is going to be effective mitigation, because if you look at the sums, £7,500 of each, £15,000 in total. Let's just assume a lifetime of 100 years for the IGS. Obviously, it's going to be more, but just for ease of reference. So that effectively means that there's a sum of £150 per year to manage visitors' behaviour at the Orwell Country Park as mitigation. I don't really understand how that will actually work and will actually help mitigate the impacts. Obviously, it's a fairly small sum.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Samuel. Well, that moves on slightly from the question that I asked, but in terms of that, Mr. Coleman, did you want to say something about this, and then I'll come to the council for a response as well.
Yes, thank you. So to answer your question 81, so we think there isn't a requirement for a RAMS payment for the Ipswich Garden Suburb. But even if there was, the first thing to note is that under the RAMS SPD, it's not necessarily the case that a payment is the way of providing the mitigation. And if you look at section 3.6 of the RAMS document, it explains that a recreational payment is one option, or there can be site-specific mitigation. So in terms of whether a RAMS payment should be in the policy or not, I think the answer is no, because even if mitigation is required, it isn't necessarily a RAMS payment.
Mm.
The reason we say that, or we believe it's not necessary in this case, is from the Habitats Regulations Assessment, which is your document A6, document library, and paragraph 5.16 of that document, which basically says that the country park that's being provided in the Ipswich Garden suburb is the recreational mitigation that the Ipswich Garden suburb has to provide. There isn't a separate requirement for a RAMS payment. The payment that Mr. Samuel quite rightly refers to is not a RAMS payment. It's an additional payment specifically for the purpose given in the 106. So it's a slightly different issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Evans, are you able to help Mr. Samuel in terms of some of the points that he raised in terms of his understanding of the RAMS issue?
I think I can try. I think obviously Mr. Coleman's gone through some of it. I think there's probably two questions really. One sounds more like it's to do with the RAMS as a whole, in terms of how that's going to mitigate rather than maybe specifically the Ipswich Garden suburb. In terms of obviously what Mr. Coleman said, the RAMS SPD at section 3.6 does allow for bespoke strategies to be done. So the RAMS strategy itself has obviously considered a number of factors that are needed, and a payment or a tariff has been chosen, obviously based on all the things that are going to be done. And that's primarily really going to be for those developments that can't provide on-site mitigation and obviously are therefore making a payment. There is always the option, and it has been specified in that SPD, that there might be some occasions when either a tariff isn't required, i.e. elderly homes, or alternatively, retirement homes, or alternatively for larger scale sites. So the IGS obviously being one of them. In the HRA for the local plan in 2017, it was recognised that there was a need really for a SANG, so a suitable alternative natural green space in the northern part of Ipswich. And as part of the Ipswich Garden suburb, therefore, we've got the country park, and it's the country park that provides on-site mitigation for the IGS, and in fact probably some of North Ipswich and East Suffolk as well. And then in addition to that, there is a small payment that is being made, which is not based on the RAMS tariff, but it's based on the fact that it's for the cumulative impact of the developments, as not just on that particular part of the IGS. So the approach is the IGS provides its own country park, that's on-site mitigation, and then a small amount is then provided for some other elements towards the Orwell country park. It's not the same RAMS tariff. It should be noted, so the RAMS tariff that is being calculated doesn't include any form of SANGs, and if it were to be included and therefore not provided at the Ipswich Garden suburb, then that tariff could actually be higher. The approach that's been accepted is set out in the appropriate assessment, so the project level appropriate assessment that's been done for both of the planning applications, and that set out the country park, the financial contributions from the developments for the capital cost of constructing it, and then a 10-year maintenance period for that. So obviously that's quite a large financial sum that is being paid by the IGS development, and then a much smaller sum which obviously will also go towards improvements for the Orwell Country Park. And that's an approach that has been, obviously is allowed in the RAMS. You'll see that obviously the country park has been sort of set out in policy. CS10, the supporting text explains that as the approach for the mitigation for that development. And it's something that Natural England have accepted when they obviously were consulted on the appropriate assessments. I think it probably is slightly confusing that a different approach has been taken, but it's a different type of development. It's not the same as the smaller developments where they're very unlikely to be able to provide the on-site mitigation, so they're paying for a tariff or a wider set of measures that have been seen as necessary and set out obviously in that RAMS SPD. I'm not sure if that's going to necessarily address Mr. Samuel's comments. I think that whether there are some issues more specifically on the wider SPD for the RAMS, and that's what his query is more related to rather than the IGS. If he could clarify that, if there's anything else as a follow-up question.
Well, thank you for that. I'm satisfied that oh, sorry, is there some feedback somewhere? Has somebody got their microphone on? No. Mrs. Robinson, I think you might have your microphone on. So perhaps you could turn that off for us, please. Thank you. I'm satisfied with that response. Mr. Samuel, did you have anything further you wanted to say? Otherwise, I'm happy to move on.
No, that has helped sort of clarify the issues. I think it was there is clearly an overlap, and I think one of our concerns was that the HRA appropriate assessment for both the Fonero and the Henley sites was placed on the council's website and after the actual consultation process in January 2020. It was placed, I think, in May, and that was after the decision notice. So we weren't quite sure how it all sort of hung together, but that's been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Samuel. Perhaps we can move on then to supplementary planning document, unless there's anything further on the open space provision. No, okay, well, I had no further questions on the SPD. Mr. Coleman, if I could perhaps come back to you at the correct point now to ask if there was anything you specifically wanted to say in respect to this point.
Yes, sorry, and only very quickly, I think. The paragraph 111 of the SPD, so that's your document G18, I think rightly sets out the purpose of the SPD, and its role is to provide guidance on the implementation of the policy. So in that sense, we're very comfortable with the SPD, that it's not a site allocation document in disguise, it is providing guidance. So our concern was more in relation to the wording of policy CS10 and the way that it cross-refers to the SPD, which might be taken as implying a more regulatory role for the SPD than it actually has. And that's paragraph C of policy CS10 at the top of page 76, I believe, where it says that the role of the SPD, the policy says the role of the SPD is to identify detailed locations of district and local centres and so on. And that's where I think the confusion potentially comes in. That's not the role of the SPD to actually identify site-specific allocations, but the policy might give the impression that that's its role. So in our original written submission, way back in the mist of time, we proposed some alternative wording for that part C and also the start of the next paragraph, just to clarify in the policy what the role of the SPD should be. And that was our only point.
Thank you. And has that been taken forward as a proposed change, Mrs. Evans?
Not at this time, no.
Well, I mean, I think that probably would solve the issue. So potentially that's something that the council could look at, is it? In terms
we could certainly look at that and come back to you on that point.
Thank you. Just to make it clear, the distinction between the policy and the SPD.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we can take that away and come back to you on that. That would be great, Inspector.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Was there anything else in terms of the SPD that anybody wished to raise? No? Okay, thank you. I hand over then to my colleague, Mr. Hayden, who's going to look at the affordable housing provision and viability, and this is question 83. Thank you, Mr. Hayden.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Okay, so I've got a number of follow-up questions for the council, but also Mersey Homes in relation to affordable housing viability. So it relates to question 83. So the question was, what evidence is there to demonstrate that the development of the Ipswich Garden suburb would be viable and that the target of 31% affordable housing would be deliverable, given that planning permissions for the first two phases provide for 5% and 4% affordable housing only. So I've read through the various viability documents, both the whole plan viability appraisal, but also the appraisal documents and the cost review documents for Ipswich Garden Suburb. So the Mott MacDonald cost review, the Gerald Eve viability assessment. So and that's really where my questions relate to try and understand the consistency between these in respect of affordable housing. So if I just come to the council first, and Mr. Ford, I'm not sure whether that's Ms. Evans or Mr. Cook to answer, but what I want to understand is, of those documents, what is the viability evidence on which the council relies to support a target of 31% affordable housing across the IGS scheme?
Shall I start and then maybe pass over to Stuart, if that's okay, Inspector?
Thank you, that's fine.
Okay, so obviously the IGS allocation was put in for the 2017 local plan, and obviously the documents you're referring to in terms of the stage 1 and stage 2 IDP obviously forms part of that to make a judgment and get the right level of affordable housing. And obviously at that point it's at a level at 31%. So those documents were used to assist and get the right balance of affordable housing level in the adopted CS10. Obviously now that we have coming into this particular review, we've had a whole plan viability report that's been done that's obviously looked at the IGS, and that's obviously now what's in front of us in terms of still supporting the findings that were made in those previous reports, and it's obviously the more up-to-date assessment. I think if I pass over to Stuart if he wants to add anything at this moment.
Okay, Mr. Cook, do you want to?
Yeah.
Right on.
Okay.
I've got two Stuart Cooks on my screen. I've got a Stuart C icon, and your camera is now on, so I'm not sure whether
I'm the correct one, I think, for this purpose.
Okay. All right.
And just to follow on from Lisa there, in terms of the approach taken with the whole plan viability has been to look at the development as a whole. So the 3,500 up to 3,500 dwellings, the two phases you refer to, Henley Road and Land South Railway, there are smaller parcels in relation to the whole development, and I think it's quite clear that there's a number of viability inputs in terms of those phases which differ.
I'll come on to those, because I've got a specific question related to those two and the basis on which those affordable housing proportions were agreed. I think I just wanted to understand the consistency between the various viability reports. If I could just pick that up with you, Mr. Cook. So if I go to that whole plan viability assessment, so the Aspinall Verde assessment, so I'm looking at page, it's in appendix 6 of that document, and it's page 21 of 24 in appendix 6, but it's basically the page that has the development costs of the appraisal for the 3,500 unit greenfield high value scheme, which I take it is the Ipswich Garden Suburb one. So in there, there's a section 106 cost allowance of 45 million. Whereas if I go to the original Mott MacDonald cost report and the Gerald Eve appraisal, the assessment of section 106 costs in there is significantly higher. So if I go to table 2.2 of the Gerald Eve report, which basically has the Mott MacDonald report as its source. So in there, the Mott MacDonald figure for section 106 costs is 76 million. So I'm just wondering about the reliability of the whole plan viability assessment appraisal of the IGS scheme, given that the assumption for section 106 is significantly lower. than the original cost report. What was the basis for that?
Okay. As we set out in the whole plan viability report, we've analysed the two sets of agreed Section 106 contributions agreed on the two previous phases. They're quite a detailed breakdown in terms of education. It's all set up within figure 511 and figure 513 in terms of the breakdown in terms of costs. And through consultation with the council, it's stated that it believed that sort of going forward, that was a realistic sort of package of contributions going forward to mitigate the development. So we agreed that it was acceptable to take an average of these two figures as being the most up-to-date cost to use, and agreed on the site to represent in the whole plan viability statements.
So let me just turn to those. So figures 511 and 513. Yeah. Do you have a page number at all for those?
So page 62 and it jumped over page 64 and 65.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so yours is based on a figure per dwelling, then I take it.
Yeah.
Derives from those, yeah?
Yeah, correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that's how you arrive at 45 million. Okay, so are we saying that the cost estimated by Mott MacDonald is far and above what is likely to be required in the future? Yeah, I don't know whether Mrs. Evans, you want to respond.
Okay, I'll try and help where I can on that. So obviously, what Vic has just gone and referred to is obviously what went into the committee reports. Obviously, are the most up to date in terms of the infrastructure sort of Section 106 costs that were there. There were things that obviously were considered during the applications themselves. So we've got a management, just for example, we've got a management company rather than the Ipswich Borough Council taking on the open space and the drainage side of it, and that was quite a considerable sum, which is why it went to a management company. So that would have been Section 106 obligation, which obviously hasn't been included within that committee report. We've also got issues with the secondary school. There was talk about whether that would be a poultry purchase order for the land. So again, that's a different tax. So in terms of what's happened in the Mott MacDonald and Gerald Eve bits, obviously they're looking at it as a sort of certain case, but things have moved on over time. And obviously we've now got something which is more detailed in terms of what actually is going to definitively be provided by those projects. And I would say that obviously accounts for some of the differences at this time.
Yeah, so I mean, there is an allowance in there for primary school, secondary school, sixth form. So you're not saying those are separate costs which weren't included? No,
so obviously there's the educational costs for the actual construction of the dwellings, but there's also the requirement for the land, and there was discussions through the planning application to whether to secure the actual land on the Red House site, there'd need to be a compulsory purchase order. Obviously that would have added, additional costs. I said the management company is something that was debated throughout the planning application, and that was quite a few million when it was looked at actually what costs would be. So there are differences in what's happened during the course of the planning applications that have obviously led to what you now see as the Section 106 contributions that were forming part of the agreed legal agreement.
Yeah, so sorry if I'm a little bit slow on the uptake here, but just to clarify, so the cost for the compulsory purchase of the land, where has that gone to then?
That's no longer required. We now got a, well, I'm sure County will interrupt if necessary, because James is nodding his head. There's now an option agreement to secure that land, so it's done differently, and there's no financial requirement under any of the applications.
Okay. All right, so that's the reason for the difference between the figures. So from the council's perspective, and Aspinall Verde, the figure that's in the whole plan viability assessment of 45 million for section 106 is now a more realistic figure for the whole of the scheme.
I think it's something you can say is more realistic based on obviously the applications that have gone before us at this time.
Yeah. Okay. That deals with section 106 costs. So the other element of costs, because the overall sort of infrastructure and section 106 costs in the original Mott MacDonald cost report was 132 million across the whole scheme. So there was 76 million of section 106, and we've dealt with that now. So that's a more realistic figure of 45 million. But there's also a figure of, if I look at table, yeah, Mr. Edwards, I'm sorry, I can see you have your hand up, and I will come to you. If you let me just complete my questions, I will come to you. Yeah, so if I go to table 2.1, which deals with abnormal costs, so there's a figure there of 55, nearly 56 million on for abnormal costs. And what I then couldn't see in the whole plan viability assessment is where that's accounted for in the Aspinall Verde report. So if I'm looking back at page 21 of 24 in appendix 6, where is the allowance for abnormal costs in that report, in that appraisal? Mr. Cook, do you want to assist me with that?
Yes, so with regards the abnormals, we've taken the approach in terms of just looking at the residential parcel in isolation. So the likes of providing the take a step back. So as we set out in the plan viability report, we've assumed the cost of providing some elements of the scheme is subject to a HIF bid, which will be part of it. So in relation to the country park, we're saying that's in relation to a HIF bid. So we've taken that sort of abnormal cost out of the equation, and we're just dealing with in terms of delivery of the residential parcel itself. So we're just looking at the whole in terms of just being for the housing. So we don't have an extra additional cost in the appraisal for that.
Sorry, you say you have or you haven't?
No. If you go to paragraph 5.89 of the whole plan viability report, page 61.
Can you give me a page number?
Page 61.
Yeah. Thank you.
So to read out, so paragraph 3.7, the committee report for 4th of April 2018 explains IBC have been successful in a bid for HIF funding. So that does contribute towards Country Park and the 2 railway bridges. So there's a big part of the abnormal costs which are not included in my appraisal, because obviously that's been dealt with through the HIF funding.
Yeah, so the 2 railway bridges though are section 106 elements, aren't they? In the Mott MacDonald report.
Yeah. But,
and likewise the Country Park as well. So what I'm trying to find is a comparable allowance for the abnormal works in table 2.1 of the Mott MacDonald report. So those elements there, where are those reflected in the whole plan viability assessment appraisal?
Okay, yeah. So I believe, so I'm just going to look at my report there. That I think 1,500 per dwelling for some abnormals was an externals of 12%. Our externals is 15%, so that would absorb that normal cost.
Okay, so
we've cut our numbers differently.
You've allowed 15% for externals.
Yeah.
Sorry, where do you take the 12% from?
So I'm just in Geraldine's appraisal for the IGS.
Yeah.
So appendix 9 talks about. It's got 12% for externals.
Appendix 9.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just give me. Sorry, you just give me a page number for that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm looking at the Geraldine appraisal.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a page.
Appendix.
Page 101, or maybe on the. Try 197 of the PDF.
Are you talking about the Geraldine report? Sorry, just bear with me. Yeah, so this is D46. Sorry,
Sorry.
I just needed to reopen it. For some reason, it closed down on me. So appendix 9, okay.
Probably somewhere else in the report, but that's what I just found it.
Just bear with me. Right, okay, I'm on appendix 9 now. Thank you.
Yes, I realised it's probably better to stay table 3.2. I found the reference again. But
so in appendix 9, yeah, so they've allowed 12% for externals, whereas you've allowed 15%. I mean, externals normally cover. Do they not normally cover sort of on-plot externals? Is that not what externals normally allow for? Because there's a separate figure in the Geraldine report for abnormals, isn't there?
Yeah, well, but I think you need to look at it in the round in terms of the two figures, really. You know, you can cut it either way in terms of a lower percentage. They've gone for low percentage in terms of external works at 12%, and I did say I've just wrapped it up as a higher external allowance.
Yeah, but even so, the external allowance at 15% is in the whole plan viability assessment 60 million. Yeah. Okay, so that's where you say the abnormal cost is reflected. Okay.
And it comes down to, you know, the Geraldine reports refers to like sustainability at sort of £2,000 per dwelling. We applied 3%.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, it's looking at sort of the cost in the round, looking at the latest available information.
Yeah. Okay. Could you just deal with the? Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah. Could you just help me on just coming to the interest costs? So I know this was a point raised by Mr. Edwards, and appreciate Mr. Edwards may want to come in on this point, but you prepared a note to explain how you dealt with finance, the cost of finance interest, and you say that in relation to IGS that you're satisfied that was covered accurately in here. Yeah. So just if I just look at that page of your appendix 6 of the whole land viability appraisal that we were looking at, if I look at the cost allowance for interest at 6.5%, it's an overall figure of 1 million. But that's on a development cost of 766 million. So it did seem that that was a very low figure for 6.5% interest, even allowing for the fact that it doesn't all, you don't borrow all of the money in year one, you borrow it over the course of the development. Is that an accurate figure for interest at that scale of cost?
Okay, so in the appraisal, so you just quoted the figure of 1.04 million. Okay, so that's come off the development cost, but there's a second interest payment calculation which looks at the land as well. So if you just scroll on to the next page of the PDF, okay, you've got interest on land, 6.5% on the 64 mil, so an extra 4.197 mil to add to that figure as well. So the interest has been treated separately on land and the development costs. And I think another point which I think I put in the note as well, we are showing a viability surplus of about 8.7 million. So if I'd say if there's concern in terms of interest payment as a lump sum, there's a sufficient surplus to pick up additional interest payments as well. So again, it's important to look at the inputs and the results in the round rather than be fixated in terms of one input or one output.
Sorry, I'm not fixated on that. No. I'm just trying to understand the figures.
That's fine.
So you're saying there's a total of around 5 million, just over 5 million allowed for land and development costs. Interest. But you're then saying there's a surplus of around about 8 million.
8.7 million,
8.7. So you're saying that roughly speaking, you're saying that the interest rate is accurately reflected, but even if not, there's a surplus there that can soak up some of the difference. Okay. That's helpful. And I'll come to Mr. Coleman, because I've just got a question for you on those two reports. But Mr. Edwards, I think you wanted to make a point on this.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'll be brief. Just there's two quick points. First is on the clarification note for finance for the updated on paragraph 6.2 on page 7. This is about methodology. It's not about inputs or outputs. This is what we've been saying. This is the method. Stuart's written, we have sought to minimize the interest payments by spreading the cost infrastructure and section 106 through the cash flow. But PPG states that is not the purpose of this to minimize cash flow. As he explicitly stated, he wants to minimize the interest payments, but it's to represent them as accurately as possible. That's very important in regards to infrastructure costs. As you know, Inspector Clues found the viability unsound because of the infrastructure issues which were attempted to be backloaded, but he found they had to be put in up front, and that had a significant impact on the interest payments and the overall financing costs. And that's what we say. There's also an input issue around flat values, where there are 1,000 flats in the development, and they're all £900 per square metre higher than in the low area. So those 2 points.
Just hold on there. I've seen your written comments. I'm not interested in discussing all of those points here. No. I was just dealing with the interest payments issue specifically, and hear the point you made, which you put in your written comments. Thank you. So there's one more you wanted to make on that specific point.
There is just one more point, and it's related to the interest costs because it relates to the achievability on the site in terms of the numbers of affordable housing that can be provided, which is actually only 21%, not 35%. It's not possible to do that. And even
we'll come on to that. I'll come on to that. On the interest payments issue, that's all you wanted to say, yeah?
Yes, basically there seems to be a contradiction with the NPPG about the way that interest payments are treated.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Coleman, can I just ask you for your comments on the robustness of the conclusions in the site-specific viability appraisal for IGS? So both the whole plan viability assessment, but perhaps in particular the Gerald Eve assessment, particularly as it relates to affordable housing.
Yes. So if I take you back to, if I can take you back to our original CS10 representation, we set out in there that, because this, I've taken you back there, so because it starts with your figure of 132 million, which was the Mott MacDonald figure. And that just, as a marker, that original figure of 132 million worked out at an infrastructure cost of about £535,000 per net developable acre. So that's our sort of original marker of what the infrastructure cost meant. Mr. Cook has rightly pointed out that there was the HIF funding that came in, and obviously things do change over time. So when the site-specific appraisal was done for Henley Gate and also for Fuller Road, that infrastructure cost was reassessed. And again, it's in our hearing statement, but the comparable figure for Henley Gate was £420,000 per net developable acre. So that's the effect of the HIF and the other changes between Mott MacDonald and the Henley Gate appraisal. That infrastructure cost comes down. And it also came down for Fonero as well, which came down to £344,000 per net developable acre. So it is true. It's obviously the case that things have moved on since the original Mott MacDonald report, and through the work that Crest and CBRE and Ipswich did on those viability appraisals, what you get on the site-specific appraisals is a much more accurate and nuanced approach, because it is dealing with a list of infrastructure that's been agreed for those sites. When you look at the Aspinall Verde infrastructure cost, which is back to that same page that you've been looking at, page 333 of the PDF, but it's the one that's got the costs on there. They have an infrastructure cost of 79,000 per net developable acre, and you sort of you hit the nail on the head in your questioning, really, which is how did that infrastructure cost come down so much in the Aspinall Verde report? And you were given the answer about, well, the externals have gone up 15%. Well, that's true. There is a 15% externals in the Aspinall Verde report, but the two appraisals for Henley Gate and Fonero also had externals in there as well as a cost item, which, as you rightly point out, is the externals for developing a residential plot. So your build cost is the unit itself. Your externals is the garden and the estate road and the landscaping that goes around it. So that's not your strategic infrastructure costs. So again, going back to our original CS10 policy statement, the things that, CS10 representation, the things that we set out that were missing from the Aspinall Verde appraisal were the site-wide strategic infrastructure costs. It's the foul drainage connection, it's the services and diversions, it's the acoustic fencing, it's the suds, it's the archaeology, all of those costs on a strategic site that are all real costs that a developer has to pay for, which were all set out in the Mott MacDonald report, but are not in the Aspinall Verde report. So there are a few. Oh, and on the point of interest, we don't dispute the 6.5%. It's just if you take 6.5% of a higher figure, you get a higher finance cost than if you take 6% of a lower figure. So again, the finance cost really comes down to you need to have your infrastructure cost right in the first place in order to get the right finance cost. So I think it is that difference in the Aspinall-Verdi report, which, to be fair, is a whole plan viability assessment. It hasn't gone into the forensic detail that the two site-specific appraisals went into, but it really is that strategic infrastructure cost that doesn't come through in the Aspinall-Verdi report, that does come through in the two site-specific appraisals. And we all know that there is a fundamental difference between them, because two of them come up at 5% and 4%, and the other one says 31% and a surplus. So there clearly is a pretty major discrepancy between them, and it is the allowance for the strategic infrastructure cost that's what we've identified as the reason for the difference. Sorry, I should just explain. The other Stuart C on the call is Stuart Cock from Mersey Homes, who is sort of with me to dip in on this if need be. So apologies for not explaining that at the start.
That was pointed out to me in the background, sorry. So someone's just clarified, the programme officer has clarified that for me, so thank you. Yeah, so that's helpful. So yeah, so you're saying the figures for infrastructure in the Gerald Eve and Mott MacDonald reports more accurately reflect, in your view, the Section 106 and infrastructure costs of the site as a whole. Correct.
I mean, they have been refined. The most accurate figures are in the two site-specific appraisals.
Okay, thank you. Can I just come, because that's, I mean, the Gerald Eve report does conclude, doesn't it, that, so coming now to the percentage of affordable housing, the Gerald Eve report does conclude, doesn't it, that 30.6% affordable housing is viable on a figure of 3,499 units. That's based on, the infrastructure and 106 costs of 132 million. What's your, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that conclusion. So I think it's page 90 of the Gerald Eve report.
Well, it turned out not to be correct, because the two site-specific appraisals have proved that, however the assumptions have varied, and it's not the infrastructure cost, but the other assumptions have varied, those appraisals have shown that 30 point whatever it was % wasn't actually achievable, and we know what is achievable now through those consents, because obviously there is the review mechanism, so we know that it could go up from 5 and 4%. But what those appraisals have showed is that the Gerald Eve report couldn't be taken through to achieve that level of viability when those sites were assessed in detail. Again, the Gerald Eve report is a whole plan viability assessment effectively as well, isn't it? It's a broad analysis, and in all of these things, it's common practice that if you've got a site-specific appraisal which has looked at the real costs on an individual site, the real values, then that is the one that is the most reliable.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to come back to the council now on this. Just bear with me. Yeah. So really, it's coming now to the two schemes that have already been negotiated, where planning consents have already been negotiated and agreed. So 4% and 5% affordable housing. So I'm just interested in on the basis on which the council has negotiated affordable housing at 4 and 5% on those figures, on those first two phases. If the Gerald Eve report indicated it was viable to achieve between 21 and 35%, depending on the assumptions that you make on in terms of future sales values. Why only 4 and 5% if a much higher figure was considered to be viable?
I'll try and do my best on that, if that's okay. I think one of the things I would just like to clarify, so we've talked a lot about the site-specific reports, but obviously they are commercially confidential, so they're not things that would be able to be passed over to Aspinall-Verdi to include within obviously their whole plan viability. In terms of the work that obviously was done when we were looking at the level for the adoption of CS10, it clearly is a whole plan viability. It clearly identified that because there are some larger infrastructure items that need to come at the start of the development, that there was always going to be the potential for there to be lower levels of affordable housing at the start, and that you would then obviously seek to achieve higher levels over the plan period. It's a long-term project, and obviously things will change over that time. That's clearly set out in the infrastructure delivery plan, where and the inspector also recognised that when policy CS10 was adopted, that there would be those lower levels of affordable housing at the start, and then we would be looking at seeking obviously higher levels as time goes on, and that should be secured through viability reviews. Now, that's the approach that's obviously being taken with the two current applications. There are some larger level elements of infrastructure at the time that the reports were done, which is 2018. It was showing obviously for this to be viable, and that includes the profit level that obviously was being sought for it to be commercially deliverable, that only 4 and 5% could be achieved at that time. But we do have two viability review mechanisms which seek to obviously increase that level as time goes on. And there are other sites that on the IDS that might come forward at later stages where situations are different. It's obviously, you know, the same conclusions have been reached as the Asmal Verde site, the 31% across a whole plan, the whole plan period for the IGS could be achieved. You know, we'll obviously have to see what happens when applications come in, but the policy does allow that flexibility. You know, this is a site we should be seeking to achieve the most affordable housing that can be provided on this greenfield site with a high value. One thing I did want to clarify in terms of the fact that phase 2 planning said that only 21% is now mathematically viable. I apologise, Kevin, but the calculations that are put in the table that's been provided in their Matter 6 statement is incorrect. I think there's been some wrong assumptions in terms of the Section 106 elements. So I'll try and make it clear, but in their particular statement, they've provided a table that looks at the affordable housing provision. Now, the 4 and 5% for the two applications are based on the whole of the development. So for the Henley Gate, it's 5% of 1,100 houses, which should be 55 units. And those 55 units are required to be provided within the first 400 homes. And then for the Fonero, it's 4% of 815 dwellings, which is 33 dwellings in total. And again, there's an obligation for those to be provided in the first 455 units, which is, I think, where the mistake's being made. After that, we are looking at contributions from the remainder of the land coming, or the remainder of the sites coming forward, and the obligation or the definition within the Section 106 on deferred affordable housing contributions does allow for up to 35% of the entire development, including what we say is the baseline, which is that 55 and 33 units. So mathematically, the Section 106 does not prohibit 35% being achieved on any what we call phase, which is a land parcel in terms of the neighbourhood and the ownership, which is shown on map IGS 1. Obviously, it's slightly different to what we're being asked for, whether it can be achieved, but obviously there is an incorrect assumption that we couldn't get 35% on a phase or 31% overall by the way that the Section 106 is being drafted.
Yeah, so just let me ask about that. Could I just ask you to confirm, you said that 4 and 5% were negotiated because on the first two phases because there were some larger infrastructure items at the start.
Sorry, so obviously it's an overall package. So obviously they were looking at, see HIF is one thing. So the HIF has obviously looked at the country park capital costs and then the bridge capital costs. We've obviously got sales values. I mean, it's a combination, isn't it, in terms of what were the
items? Sorry, just answer my question, please. What were the items at the start, the larger infrastructure items?
Sorry, Inspector. So you would have some of the upgrades of the some of the roundabouts that needed to be improved. Obviously, some of the strategic infrastructure. So there's basins going in for the country park, which are not forming part of the Housing Infrastructure Fund. You've obviously got all the utilities that need to go in at the start. All of those are obviously larger upfront costs that need to be put in, and obviously form part of the viability for that particular development.
Okay. Yeah. Where is all that set out? I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to understand, because I understood in the IDP schedule for Ipswich Garden Suburb, so this is core document D47, that seems to show that the costs of infrastructure would be equalised across the 3 neighbourhoods. So, and that there would be some form of clawback from future schemes where earlier phases had to bear a greater proportion of the upfront costs. So, is that not the basis on which the scheme goes forward, that those upfront costs are shared across the scheme as a whole?
So the way that part of that's being done in terms of looking at the site was looking at developable and non-developable areas, and a benchmark land value was assessed during the process of these applications at the start, because obviously you've got, you know, each neighbourhood has things it needs to bring forward. So the country park is obviously one of them, which is a non-developable site. You've got on the Fonero site, you've got the district centre, and then on the Red House you've got the secondary school provision. So it was a way of sharing out those elements. In terms of some of the infrastructure, it's quite complicated, I'll be honest. So obviously with the secondary school, you've got contributions that would be paid by everyone for that piece of infrastructure. With the country park, it was always envisaged that everyone would pay towards the capital cost of it. And then also, and so Crest would deliver, and then there would be money from others obviously then secured to pay for part of that. The 2 bridges over the railway lines are slightly different insofar as how they were envisaged to be paid for. They would be, from the vehicular point of view for the bridge, it was always envisaged potentially to be shared between the development of the Fonero to the south and Hendigate to the north. But judged on this particular, the application we've got in front of us, it would be the Crest development that would pay for that should the Housing Infrastructure Fund not be there. And for the pedestrian bridge, it would be proportionately shared between Fonero and Hendigate, because they both benefit from the need for that from a planning reason. So there's quite a lot, obviously, of infrastructure, and we've obviously had to judge it based on the applications that are in front. The difficulty is obviously the site specific viability appraisals are confidential, so haven't been obviously put in the public domain.
Okay, but I'm
not sure if that answers your question. Is it?
Having the detail in front of me, it's very difficult to draw any sort of firm conclusions on that. But it does seem to me, from the evidence that is in front of us, that there isn't strong evidence that the initial schemes have had to bear a disproportionate amount of upfront infrastructure costs, given that, you know, big ticket items like the country park, like the secondary school, are to be shared across the 3 phases, and matters like some of the initial upfront infrastructure costs for the country park and the bridges are being supported by a HIF's funding bid. So I can't see from the evidence that it's clear that there's a basis for such a disproportionate approach as it would seem to be the case in terms of affordable housing, where the early schemes deliver a very small proportion of the overall requirement and the later schemes a much higher proportion. I can't see the evidence supporting that. I think that's what I'm trying to say to you.
Yeah, I suppose the difficulty is that at the same time, though, from a policy point of view, so it does allow that flexibility to allow for further, you know, housing, to provide further levels of affordable housing as time goes on. I mean, at the moment, obviously, whilst we've had, it's difficult, so we can't provide you the evidence on the cost appraisals for the planning applications, given their sort of confidentiality. but obviously there's nothing to say that we've got any evidence that it won't improve as time goes on, and it won't be able to achieve those amounts. And I think that's the difficulty with a project sort of this long. But I know that Stuart had his hand up, so I might transfer to him if that's okay, Inspector.
Oh, that's all right, I'll do that, thank you. So I think what we're coming down to, which is where we needed to get to, is how realistic the figure of still seeking 31% affordable housing across the scheme is, given the low levels of affordable housing negotiated on the first two schemes. And I appreciate you provided an update on the figures in the Mersey Homes statement, which I wasn't able just to keep a note of, and it may be helpful to provide an agreed position on those figures, just to clarify that. But if I simply take those figures in the Mersey Homes report, it does seem to me that it's entirely unrealistic now to expect the scheme as a whole to achieve 31%, given that the relatively low levels of affordable housing on the first two phases. And then I'll bring Mr. Coleman in. If you could answer that, Miss Evans.
Obviously, we don't have a site-specific appraisal of the Red House site in front of us, so I think it's very difficult to make an assessment of what they can and can't achieve, being truthful. I think obviously we've obviously looked at the two applications in front of us on site-specific viability reports and assessed those in great detail, including going through the cost plan. And I think that's what we would need to see in front of us in terms of evidential sort of, from us, unless we've got exactly what's going to go forward with a development that we think is acceptable, with those costs that they're stating and the up-to-date sales values, etc. It's very hard to know definitively what they can or can't achieve. We've only got their comments that they're going to be in line with what was done on the two previous appraisals. I've got no evidence in an appraisal form to be able to review that in the manner that we would expect with any planning application.
But could I ask Mr. Cook, because I think he was wishing to come in on this, and I wonder if you might just give him the opportunity to address that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Was there anything further, Mrs. Evans? No. Mr. Cook.
Yeah, so I'm just saying as well, in terms of those two previous phases, from the bits of information I found through the planning applications and planning statements, there are some differences in terms of inputs, which will get, again, distorted effect in terms of viability. For example, on the Henley Road, the developable area for the residential is on 40% of the land, whereas in the plan-wide viability it's 60%. So they're required to acquire, as it were, in terms of a much bigger element of land which will not be built upon. So that 60% is the average across the whole. If I was to swap my developable area to 40%, then that would wipe out viability. So, I think that's a consideration. Also, on the land south of the railway, that development density for the first phase 1A, they say it's 30 dwellings per hectare. Then it ramps up to 32 dwellings per hectare. We've assumed 32 dwellings per hectare on the whole. So there's an 8% difference there. So in terms of density, again, that will have a drag in terms of viability. So, Ms. Evans is correct in terms of the site specifics to make a comparison, but even just in terms of a couple of headlines there, I can see why, again, we're not comparing like for like. That's the issue at this stage.
Okay, well, that's not entirely helpful, not comparing like with like, but anyway. Mr. Coleman, appreciate there was a large number of points made there, but I did want to wait until the points had been made by the council to give you a chance to come back. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think on the last point from Mr. Cook, I think I agree with what he says. They're not comparing like for like, but that comes back to my point that the site-specific appraisal is therefore the more accurate one, because that's the one that's actually assessing the density of the site and the developable area and so on. So I take the point, but I think that rather supports the fact that the whole plan viability appraisal is less helpful to you. I think on Mrs. Evans' Mrs. Evans's point, sorry, we're not talking about Red House Farm neighbourhood at all here. We're still talking about the table dealing with the whole 3,500. So this has nothing to do with what can or can't be delivered on Red House Farm. In terms of the table itself, I disagree with Mrs. Evans's. Mrs. Evans is disagreeing with ourselves. I wish I hadn't started to say that sentence. Sorry. There's still a disagreement between us as to whether the table is accurate or not. We think it is accurate. But so your suggestion of us sorting that out behind the scenes, I'm more than happy to do that, so that we have that discussion offline to agree between us what's right and isn't. Yes, our view is that it is just now mathematically impossible, irrespective of anything else. And the third point was in relation to how the phasing of infrastructure affects the viability appraisal, which was one of your sort of earlier questions on here. The results of those appraisals are not lowering the affordable housing in the first phase because of high infrastructure costs. Those appraisals show viability of 5% affordable housing throughout the development based on infrastructure costs for the life of the development. It isn't the case that infrastructure has been brought down that affordable housing has been brought down in the early phase because of high infrastructure costs for the reasons that you set out. So the 5% and the 4% are genuinely what those developments can provide. The review mechanism comes in if, for example, values go up in the future and therefore there's more value in the scheme to contribute to more affordable housing. You don't get more affordable housing because infrastructure costs go down in later phases, because that's not the way those appraisals are assessed.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, and I should point out actually the amount of affordable housing in the first phase on both sites is actually higher than the appraisal suggests is viable, because as Mrs. Evans rightly points out, some of the affordable housing for the later phases is brought forward to phase one, but you can't double count it. So if you bring some of the later phases forward to phase one, you can't then count it in phase two. So that's why we think the table is still right.
Okay. Can I just come, it's really a final question on this. And I think I am going to ask both the council and Mersey Homes to take another look at the table that's in Mersey Homes' statement and to come up with an agreed table, even if you disagree on the figures. I think if we can have a joint table and an explanation as to your respective figures. I think the final question really for Mr. Coleman is, I mean, it does seem to me that the policy at the moment, it seeks 31% affordable housing. I mean, it's a reasonable point that IGS is probably the council's best opportunity to maximise affordable housing to begin to approach addressing the affordable housing need in Ipswich. So it does, as drafted, it does say that the council will seek 31% affordable housing, and that for each individual application, the level will be assessed based on achieving the overall target and achieving viability. So it does seem to me that it sets an aspirational figure, but allows for viability to site-specific viability, which I think is what you're arguing for. That's really the most accurate way of dealing with this. It allows for site-specific viability to come up with what is a viable level of affordable housing. So as drafted, does the policy really force you into a position in respect of a future level of affordable housing on phase three?
It is a fair point. I think what the two applications that have come through already have shown is that whatever the policy may aspire to, the right level of affordable housing will be tested at the application stage. So that's a fair point. And also it's entirely fair that the policy should be aspirational in terms of the amount of affordable housing that the council is seeking. Our point is it's also got to be possible. And if it's not possible, then you shouldn't have a policy, you shouldn't have a target in a policy that just can't be achieved. And secondly, it's got to be realistic. And so even if mathematically it is possible to get beyond where I say you can get to 25% or whatever the case may be, actually, what is the reality what's the chances of values improving so much over the life of this development that it would move from 5% to 35%? And the answer is it's not very likely. So yes, aspiration is fine. Yes, the policy doesn't prevent us from having an appraisal at the application stage. That's absolutely fine. It's just about starting with a policy that's aspirational but realistic and mathematically possible.
Yeah. Okay. Mrs. Robinson, you have your hand up. Are we able to? Yeah, are we able to hear from you? Thank you. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not picking up your voice, Mrs. Robinson. Although you're unmuted, I can't hear you. Yeah, I can't hear you, Mrs. Robinson. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Finally, I can hear you now.
Oh, I apologise. One point I'd like to.
Is this on affordable housing?
Yeah, well, it bears on affordable houses and viability. As we've learned, the public can't really interrogate the efficacy of the deliverability or viability because of the requirement to know the detail of site-specific work, which obviously we don't know. We just have to take at face value. You mentioned, or I think Ms. Evans mentioned, there are going to be external costs on improvements on, she suggested, roundabouts. And this is in regard to the foul drainage requirements for all of the schemes, including the Red House scheme at some point and the Mersey schemes off Westerfield Road.
Yeah.
There's going to be considerable need for negotiation with Anglian Water because of the storage systems, as far as we know, that have been proposed and may change when we get another third site specific, but the existing two site specifics. We've had a long and difficult set of concerns about the feasibility of the proposals that are being made that may result in further costs which will have further impacts on housing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Those are all the questions I had on affordable housing at this stage. I don't know whether the council had anything to say by way of response either to Mrs. Robinson or Mr. Coleman. Yeah, Mrs. Evans.
I'll try and keep it really quick. I think obviously most of the points have been made. In terms of obviously the policy, I think you sort of specified it quite clearly that the policy does allow for us, to have something that may be said as aspirational, but obviously is trying to achieve, the most affordable housing that can be achieved on this particular site. The policy has clearly allowed for a lower amount to be done, and you're right insofar as, and as Mr. Coleman has specified as well, that it will be judged based on the site-specific appraisals for each application that comes forward. That will, judge the right level, and the policy has allowed that, as can clearly be seen by the two applications that have been determined. But it also allows us to have the reviews in place that, should circumstances change, which we do expect will do as time goes on this long-term project, which is 15 years potentially for the site as a whole, that obviously there will be the improvement in the levels that can be secured on the site. Obviously, we're still promoting the 31% because that is what our whole plan viability assessment has indicated. And I think the other thing that I would mention, obviously, we have sort of mentioned about the housing infrastructure fund. You don't know what might happen in the future. Whilst I can't provide the evidence to that basis, we obviously have referred to Homes England's involvement in providing grant funding for infrastructure on this site, and we are obviously talking with them on other sites in terms of bringing those forward. There is always the potential of land being acquired by IBC or Homes England and that being used for affordable housing. So I said I can appreciate it's not an evidential base. I think that it is something that we would factor in terms of wanting a level that allows us to achieve the highest viable amount of affordable housing on what is really our largest site to achieve that. I think in regard to what Mrs. Robinson said, I think she's just noting that there are obviously utilities that do factor into the costing of this site, but I don't really feel I need to discuss that any more.
Okay, can you just answer so you referred to the potential for values increasing over time and increasing the viability of the scheme. So Mersey Homes have made a suggestion in terms of a modification to the policy where that should be reflected in the policy. So they're suggesting on the second or third page of their statement, where a development is of sufficient size is therefore to be implemented in more than one viability phase prior to commencement of subsequent phases in accordance with the triggers set out, that viability of each phase would be appraised. What's your take on that as a suggested modification to the policy?
I think it's quite a complicated modification that's been obviously sought. Obviously, they're looking at going for a minimum of 5%, which I think we can't judge something that is only going to be a minimum at this point in time. We should be looking for the highest that's optimum. The wording does clearly allow for that to come in. With regard to the viability on each phase, it depends in what respect they're meaning the phase of each development. It can be quite complicated. We know with our current applications that are coming in, they could come in 7 phases. So that could be quite difficult, particularly if we've got different people taking on. Obviously, a lot of sites sometimes come in with the infrastructure developed by one site and a master developer, and then the housing lands parcelled on. The way that we've currently got it, we have 2 reviews through the process based on trigger points, and we believe that is the appropriate approach to take, and the policy that's been worded allows for us to do that. I'm not sure if I hope that answers your query.
Yeah. It does. That's a question I wanted an answer to. Mr. Coleman has your hand up. Mr. Edwards, did you have your hand up earlier? Yes, I can see your finger now. Finally, I'm sorry, I didn't notice it before. My apologies. And I'll bring you in, Mr. Coleman, shortly. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, sir. My electronic finger was obviously amputated for some reason. I just wanted to respectfully refer us back to NPPF para 57, which is the key to this whole piece. About where up-to-date policies to set out contributions expected from development. And we've heard evidence to say that the expected contributions are nowhere near what the aspirations of the policy, the draft policy, are. So the policy has to be deemed to be sort of out of date already, because the para 57 continues. So with due respect, I know you know this back to front, but all viability assessments, including any undertaken at the planning making stage, should reflect the recommended approach in national planning guidance, including standardized inputs. And my secondary point to that, sir, is going back to the flattered values. They are at the very high end of the scale. So when you're talking about value increments and overages and all this sort of thing, you're already at the top end of the flat development value. And you've got 1,000 flats there, so the margins, the wriggle room there is very small.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coleman. Yeah, did you just want to come back in respect of your suggested modifications?
Yes, please. And very briefly, the wording we put out there is just to mirror effectively what the Section 106s do at the moment. The Section 106s say define what a phase of development is for viability purposes. And they say that before the next phase begins, the viability is retested. So all our wording is doing is taking what the 106s do and putting that into the language to support the policy. It isn't trying to do anything else that other than what Ipswich are already doing, and it was just to try and clarify how the review mechanism will and does work in the 106s.
Yeah, although Council have just said that their approach is for a couple of reviews to be triggered at different points in the development cycle.
Yes, which is what that wording allows for. The wording isn't saying how many phases there are. It says the 106 sets the number of phases and you review the viability before each phase, which is just what the 106s do.
Yeah. Mrs. Evans, you just respond to that, please. That seems reasonable to me.
I'm just rereading it just to see obviously there's obviously issues in terms of the levels that are there, but obviously we could have a look at it to see whether that would be something that we feel would work. Obviously the difficulty is just whether that's I mean, it says where a development is of a sufficient size, not quite sure that's precise enough on that particular part. More than one viability phase, again, what does that mean? So I think there are some queries about whether that's the wording that we would wish to use. Would you want us to put a note on that for you at all?
I think what would be helpful if you could liaise with Mr. Coleman, both in respect of the table, revision to the table in his hearing position statement, but also in respect of any potential further revisions to the policy that you might be able to agree between yourselves. That would be incredibly helpful. So I think if you could come back on both of those. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, Inspector.
Thank you. Mr. Cutting.
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful that Mr. Coleman was explaining that the amendments is similar to what the current applications are trying to do. What we would not want to see is the reviews being a mechanism to review the costs that are associated with infrastructure such as education.
Okay. Isn't that the purpose of the isn't that the purpose of a review, though, is to review where viability is at a particular point in time? So presumably it would take account of the costs incurred at that point in time.
The issue then would be is that we have entered into a section 106 with an assumed amount of costs that provide for largely build cost for education, and if that review mechanism was attempting to review the build costs of the schools at any one time, that could get very, very complicated indeed. And if anything, it's likely to increase, and because when the greater certainty is known, the development costs we tend to see of schools increases slightly. It also increases as build costs increase. We would be happy for the estimated cost of infrastructure to be agreed at the section 106 stage when that was agreed, subject to indexation.
Yeah. Okay. Mrs. Evans.
I think just for information and for those who aren't aware, with the two applications we've actually got a standard viability review template that's appended within the section 106 that obviously sort of goes through what are standardised elements to go into that to then get the figure at the end. Obviously, whether that's the approach we would take going forward, obviously we'd take independent viability advice on that. But for the purposes of those two applications, it was to obviously sort of make some very clear review of what was required. And like I said, they are in the public domain. We could always provide you with a copy of that if that was helpful to you, Inspector.
Yeah, that might be helpful, perhaps as an attachment to the joint note you're preparing with Mr. Coleman. Yeah.
Of course.
Was there something?
Just very briefly, if I may. So obviously, we're very happy to go away and discuss with Mr. Coleman potential amendments to his proposed wording, but obviously that will be without prejudice to the council's position that 31% remains appropriate, and the council doesn't accept, as Mr. Edwards, I think, put it, that that all the evidence shows that the expected contributions are nowhere near realistic at 31%. Mr. Cook has told you that on the two sites in question, there were particular considerations, particular developable areas, particular densities, and I heard your perhaps slight criticism of him when he said we're not comparing like with like, and you said, well, no, we're not. But the whole plan viability appraisal applies certain assumptions across the whole of the IGS site, and it doesn't assume that every parcel that comes forward will precisely accord with each of those assumptions. And so on those particular sites, there was the headline points, I think you picked up, developable area density. That doesn't mean that those are going to be achieved across the entirety of the site. So I think the council's position remains obviously that it has faith and confidence in the whole plan viability appraisal, but not not without prejudice to that position, we'll obviously be happy to discuss with Mr. Coleman some amendments to his wording.
Okay, thank you very much. That has taken us a lot longer than I expected, I'm afraid. Ms. Baker, I don't know whether this is the appropriate point to...
Well, Mr. Edwards has his hand up, Mr. Hayden. I don't know if you want to
sorry.
say finally before, and then
hand up on screen, Mr. Edwards. I'm sorry.
Just very briefly, so I'd refer you back to following the council's comments, para 11 of NPPG. This is a specific site, it's not a typology site, and the planning guidance sets out very clearly how this should all be done, and it cross-refers to NPP F para 57. The two work together in relation to very specifically defining, as far as you possibly can with clarity, at the plan making stage for large strategic sites. And this is not what's being done here. We're looking at, with all due respect to everyone and my client, we're looking at a fudge in relation to this, a broad range of things. It's perfectly possible to itemize the costs, as you've been through yourself in previous viability iterations, and with a very experienced developer at the helm. You know, there's no reason why you need to come up with a range so broad, which is about 350 houses lost between 21% and 31%. And then if you take down to 5%, the affordable housing range is increasingly lost, and it has to be made up somewhere else. So it needs to be made sound now, not to be kicked into the long grass and done later on, because that's not what the NPPG requires or the NPPF requires. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Edwards. Yeah. Sorry, Ms. Baker, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. Well, given that it's 11:11, I think now would be an appropriate time to take a break. So could I just ask you all to ensure that your cameras and your microphones are switched off, but that you stay in the hearing, and we'll resume again at 11:30. So I'll adjourn until then. Thank you.
11:29 and we'll restart at 11:30. Thank you.
Well, I actually make it 11:30 by my clock on my computer. So if everybody's ready, the hearing is resumed. I'd just like to pick up the agenda from here on in, if I may. And the next item on the agenda is education provision. And this relates to question 8 to 6 in our MIQs. And I just have one further follow-up question on this, and I'd like to direct this really to Mrs. Evans, if I may, from the council. And that is, should the policies map be amended to show the school site agreed through the option agreement between Mersey Homes and Suffolk County Council, as it differs to that allocated in the plan? What's your view on that, Mrs. Evans?
Obviously, the option agreement is not something that we're party to. It's obviously something that's an agreement with Suffolk County Council and the owners of Red House. Obviously, the current local plan proposals map does show the size and location that was felt to be appropriate for that particular secondary school. And obviously, any application could come in with as a departure to that local plan and assessed on its merits at that point in time. So we've not had the option of assessing the suitability of the change in area and location as part of a formal planning application.
So has any discussion been undertaken with the council, by the County Council and Mersey Homes at all on this?
We were always aware, as part of the application determination of both those two outline planning permissions, there was obviously how was the secondary school going to be provided. And obviously, Suffolk County Council, have looked at this in a lot of detail, and I'm sure James will make any comments on that at a later stage if directed by yourselves. But obviously, we always did highlight the fact that it is lower in terms of the size area that was expected to come forward. It's obviously now linking the primary school and the secondary school. So the secondary school was deemed to be for 2 hectares and the secondary school for 9, and I think we're at 10.67 under the option agreement and in a different location. So we have always minded and advised Suffolk County Council that it couldn't prejudice any application that might come forward with that option agreement, but obviously welcomed the fact that they were securing it through another mechanism, and that was reflected within the planning conditions and planning agreement for the now determined applications.
Okay, so I don't understand why the council wouldn't consider amending the allocation to reflect that, if that's already being discussed and agreed.
Whether we could consider maybe changing the terminology on the proposals map to maybe include broad location. I think that would probably give hopefully comfort moving forward. At the moment, obviously it doesn't state broad on that proposals map, whereas the other land uses do identify them as broad locations. I would hope that would address the point in question should an application come in with a slightly different location and different size, that the broad location in the proposals map would allow for that, I believe.
Okay, Mr. Cutting, perhaps I can come to you. I see you've got your hand up, Mr. Coleman, but if I could just hear from the County Council first of all, and then I'll come to you. Thank you, Mr. Cutting.
Thank you, Mum. So in the process of determining our position on the applications at Henley Gate and for Fonroe Village, we were very, very clear that we needed to secure the land. And what materialised from the end of this process was we agreed an option agreement with Mersey Homes on the Red House site that provided us with the comfort that we could be securing the land in which we could then be delivering the secondary school. It's one thing to be collecting the monies for the building, but actually we need somewhere to build it. And we were comforted by that option agreement. In the process of looking at that option agreement, we did consider how the site for the secondary school could sit alongside a primary school, either through an all-through route or as separate academies. We also considered how the area just to the northeast of the site, which is along the way that the water would flow and create some some flooding, how that would be taking some area away in the event of a particularly 1 in 100-year flood, and we were comforted that the modelling that we saw as part of the work done at the start of the process for 1 to 30 year was still sufficient, that there would be playing fields for primary and secondary school. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that piece of land that we've got an option agreement will be the final solution. If the government's guidance, for example, on the size of site areas for secondary schools or primary schools were to change, we would need to look at an alternative arrangement. If, for example, primary schools needed to have more area for children to play, and particularly alongside an early years setting, we might need to negotiate additional land within the development.
I see. So in terms of Mrs. Evans' suggestion relating to the policies map referring to a broad location for that, for the development of a school, would that be a more appropriate way of dealing with this, do you think, given what you've just said to me?
From a county council point of view, now we have the option agreement in place, I'd be comfortable with a broad area policy. We still need to have that certainty that a secondary school would be able to be delivered within policy, so the broad sense is quite useful for that. We do also need a defined area in which we can deliver that school. So a plan on a map that shows a site boundary, and this being a broad location, is useful. A blob on a map that shows roughly where an area would be is less so useful. What is critical is that we are able to define a site area for such facilities.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coleman, then if I could come to you, if you have any comments on this at all, please.
Well, our original representation did just point out what Mrs. Evans has already said to you, which is that everything else on the key says broad location. The only one that didn't was the secondary school. And as much for consistency as anything else, the term broad location would be appropriate. But also, as you've heard, things are not entirely fixed. The option boundary is not exactly what's on the policies map and so on. So yes, just to chip in and support that broad location seems to us the right way to resolve the issue.
Thank you. So, sorry, I'm getting an echo. Mrs. Evans, back to you. In terms of looking at this, in terms of using the phrase broad location, is that something the council can take away and come up with a proposed change and add it into your main modifications list, please?
Of course we can do. Just going back to obviously what Mr. Cutting said, just I think for some comfort for him and obviously for you as well. Obviously we have got the approximate size areas for the secondary school within our policy CS10, and also in our neighbourhood infrastructure. It does list the requirement for a secondary school in that. So I think combined with potential changes to the wording on the proposals map, I think as a totality that would give comfort for everyone involved.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Super. Is there anything else in terms of education provision then before we move on? Sorry, Mr. Hayden.
Just clarify, just to satisfy my curiosity. So I think you said, Mrs. Evans, that the option agreement has increased the land take for the secondary school from 9 to 10.7.
Sorry, decreased.
Decreased. Ah.
Oh, sorry, maybe I'll talk clearer for you. Sorry. So effectively, we've got approximate land uses tabled in CS10. The secondary school is 9 hectares and the primary schools are expected to be 2 hectares each. Obviously a combined amount of 11. And I believe off the top of my head that the option agreement is for 10.67 hectares, unless Mr. Cutting can correct me. So obviously it's a small reduction in the sizes that we would be looking to achieve on this allocation.
So it's in and around 11 hectares. Okay. Thank you. Does that clarify matters? Super, thank you. If we can move on then to community outdoor sport provision, and this is relating to question 88 on our MIQs. And I just have one follow-up question, really, and I'd like to start with you, Mr. Cutting, if I may. And would wider community access be provided to the proposed sport provision at schools? And if so, how would that be secured?
So, Ma'am, the securing of that can be part of the invite to the academies for the bid process for running the school, and it would be clear that the land that would be for playing fields would also need to be shared for community use, and that those precise terms would be set out in that process, because the academies need to effectively compete and be aware of what's going to be required from them. As we've pointed out previously, there is that possibility for those school sites to be used for community use, but the intensity of those uses needs to be a factor. The use of a playing field for that's too often will damage the playing field and needs additional maintenance, for example. So it's part of the overall management of the school. We are designing the schools in to have community use, so there would be adequate safeguarding and security concerns that come about, so that the community uses can access the site, access some of the facilities without all of the school needing to be open, for example.
Yes, and I appreciate that there is a security issue, isn't there, around opening up facilities for community use. But that would, as far as you're concerned, as the Education Authority, that would be done through an agreement with the Academy Trust,
yes.
The winning Academy Trust, in terms of any bids that are put forward. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions that anybody has in respect of community outdoor sport provision? No. Okay, can we move on then to potential impacts of the Ipswich Garden Suburb, which is question 89 of the MIQs. I think the majority of my questions were answered in respect to this matter at the previous session, but I did just have one outstanding question, and if I could direct this to Mrs. Evans, and that's it. Well, it may be you, Mrs. Evans, or it may be somebody else for the council, but I'll start with you. Should the traffic modelling include construction traffic as suggested by the representatives of SOCS and NFPG, given the length of time that the scheme will be under construction, in your view?
I'll try and answer that the best I can, but I do believe that Luke Barber from Suffolk County Council is also on the call. And he's probably better placed to answer that than I am.
That's fine. I wasn't sure whether, but I thought I'd start with you, and then we could move on to somebody else from the County Council. Obviously,
when we looked at the applications, they did look at obviously construction traffic as part of the impacts that were going to happen, and I think that we feel that obviously that has been adequately assessed. The planning applications, and obviously it's more site specific at that point rather than maybe done on the wider IGS allocation. But I will probably hand to Luke Barber if that's okay, or whether you'd like to hand to him to give a bit.
I'm happy for Mr. Barber, if he's on the call, to respond. Are you there, Mr. Barber?
I am. Let me just
thank you.
Turn my video on.
Lovely, thank you. I can see you now. So you've obviously heard the question in respect of the points that were raised by SOCS and NFPG in relation to construction and whether that's the traffic generated by that should be taken into account in the traffic modelling. I just wonder what your view is on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a issue that's often raised. I mean, the construction traffic and construction sort of management is dealt with by condition on the two granted permissions. And that would be the case for any further granted permissions. Generally, construction traffic isn't as much of an impact as the site generated traffic during the operation of the site in terms of its peak impacts on the and those peak impacts can be dealt with by condition in terms of sort of routing and times of operation and sort of layover arrangements for making sure that you don't get sort of peaks of traffic, construction traffic. So yeah, generally that wouldn't be the most onerous situation. The most onerous situation is once all of the housing is built out in terms of peak impact, and as the modelling that supports the plan is a peak level assessment, because that's the most onerous situation.
Thank you. Mrs. Robinson, I see that you would like to say something about this point. Can I ask you to make your point now then, please? I think you're still on mute, Mrs. Robinson. Oh, that's it.
Can you hear me now?
I can, thank you, yes.
SOX cannot accept the explanation and rationale given by Mr. Barber and Highways in respect of construction traffic in this location, bearing in mind there's four if you take Humberducy Lane, 4 areas that come broadly under the IGS development and further development, with the constraints of the railway line and obviously Sizewell and Felixstowe and the closure of Westerfield Road, the fact that there cannot be access from Tuddenham Road, Henley Road too, with the infrastructure works for Fowl, and generally on a site it may be that the peaks are demonstrated at build out time, but our contention is that the constraints and impacts that will ensue in this location with these constraints and the nature of the roads is going to be really significant in terms of safety, emergency vehicles getting to the villages because of the railway line. That will deflect more traffic onto Tuddenham Road, even if there isn't an outlet onto Tuddenham Road and Henley Road. And it's already gridlock. If you look at the peak traffic on Tuddenham Road currently, before any development, it's almost half the peak levels on Valley Road, which is a very different sort of road. So SOX cannot accept in this specific IGS area that general views, general approaches will apply. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Samuel, I see that you have your hand up too. Perhaps I could come to you for your points before I go back to the County Council.
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes, I take issue with the statement that the most onerous effects are going to be at the end of the development. The reason I say that is because Ipswich Borough Council or Ipswich Borough is already in breach of air quality limits in 5 air quality management areas. Air QMAs 1 and 4, which are around Chevalier Street and Norwich Road, will be the main routes for construction traffic off the A12 and the A14, both for deliveries, sort of lorry deliveries, excavations, etc. And therefore, during the construction phase, it's going to be during the construction phase that you're going to have most effects, because by the end of the development, you will have electrification of vehicles and you will have delivered modal shift. So the key issues for air quality are in the earlier years of the development, from now between say 2026, when there hasn't been any modelling at all of those issues. So you have pre-2026, you will end up with 3 IGS sites building out 280 homes per annum, where there hasn't been any assessment at all on the impacts of air quality of construction vehicles and vehicles of drivers, tradesmen to the site. Particular concern is around the junction of Valley Road and Henley Road, where again those delivery lorries vehicles will have to go through, and there hasn't been any assessment of the impact on congestion and hence on air quality at that particular junction. So our concern isn't necessarily about the levels of congestion. we do believe there will be increase, but it's the levels of air quality around those areas, particularly those that are already in breach of legally binding requirements.
Thank
What I'd like to
you.
see is an assessment of the impacts of those. And if it's fine, then great. And if not, it can be mitigated.
Thank you for that. Mr. Barber, would you like to come back on any of those points for me, please?
Hi. Yeah, no, I think the I mean the air quality assessment is based on the traffic impacts. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about air quality specifically, but I can confirm that the air quality assessment was, in terms of input data, was agreed as part of the overall modelling exercise that was done. We've obviously tested 2026 as an interim year, as well as 2036, a final year of the plan. So yeah, I mean, overall, I would just say we are content that the overall impacts of this allocation and the overall local plan allocation have been tested appropriately, is our view as a highway authority.
Thank you. Mrs. Robinson, I see you want to come back on this as well. I'm afraid you're on mute still.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. The air quality modelling or projections or estimations, I don't think they were actually surveyed, it was a projection. Some at the planning application stage predated legal action by Client Earth on DEFRA and in effect on local authorities' obligations. So that was happening around the time of any debate on the issue, for instance, at Valley Road. You also have the island site proposal at that time, which had a bearing on this. And the third issue in terms of impact is the foul storage systems and changes to Valley Road, at Henley Road, Westerfield Road and possibly Tuddenham Road, which will need to be narrowed due to the storage, under road storage and other matters. There are major modifications between Henley Road and Tuddenham Road proposed for the site specifics, infrastructure and other things. That's what we regard as part of construction. And as Mr. Samuels has said, there has been no actual data in terms of this. There was some in terms of air quality impacts if these changes to the road were brought forward as part of the plan. But I think this is an area that needs a great deal more attention, certainly in terms of the legal requirements that may be placed by the government and DEFRA on local authorities in terms of infringement costs. Currently, the courts have, I think, allowed local authorities off the hook because they were following DEFRA that was found wanting. So there's a whole messy area here. Maybe Borough's barrister can give some indication of where this is going. But the construction costs in this specific proposal are so significant, bearing in mind the actual constraints of the roads, other infrastructure like railway crossings, and we can't broad brush this at all in our view.
Thank you. Mr. Samuel, is that a legacy hand or did you want to come back on this point?
Very quickly, if I could just come back to say, suggest, might it be helpful if we could see the evidence that the air quality has been appropriately tested in the before 2026, when the air quality levels will be at their worst? Testing post 2026, the air quality levels will begin to improve, and certainly we in the latter years we don't have any concerns. It's the pre 2026 years that we have the concerns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs Evans, can I come back to you? Or Mr Force, sorry, apologies. I just see you've taken your microphone off mute.
Thank you, Madam. Just to say that I understand that yesterday, I think it was yesterday, a document was submitted called, it was entitled IBC Local Planning Examination Response to Northern Freedom Protection Group and Save Our Country Spaces Comments on Sustainability Appraisal. And I think it's that was one of the actions that we had taken away from the previous set of hearings, and it discusses the air quality impacts before 2026 or their treatment and where they're considered. And I wondered if, well, I'm not sure whether those have reached you yet, whether they've been uploaded onto the website, and obviously would be very happy to provide them to Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Robinson, and it may be, as you indicated with the other things, that they're then given the opportunity to comment on those.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not sure whether they're up on the website. I think they're being sent out today to interested parties, but we will make a decision on that. So if we can allow that to be sent out to you today, Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Robinson, that hopefully will answer some of the questions that you've raised. And we'll ask the programme officer to email you with that information later on. Okay. Is there anything else in terms of potential impacts of the Ipswich Garden Suburb before we move on? No, okay. I'd like to turn then, if I can, to the impact of Sizewell C, and this relates to question 87 of the MIQs. I just have one follow-up question, and that is to the council. Mrs Evans, what's the council's view on the statement by representatives of SOX and NFPG in their hearing position statements that the increased freight from Felixstowe docks, which is 50% I've had quoted, and 30% planned increase in train numbers have not been adequately assessed? Are you able to give me any more information on that and whether or not they have been adequately assessed?
Thank you, Inspector. I think obviously in terms of the actual increase from Sizewell, where the questions obviously gone towards, currently obviously the Sizewell's not a committed development. You're probably aware it's now out to its 5th consultation. It's running until the 18th of this month. And obviously that is looking at whether there could be further freight use for moving of materials, and that's currently proposing 3 freight movements, potentially with a 4th or maybe a 5th train movement, which would total 10 movements in total each way. I would like to sort of just clarify our position statement. It did say that the environmental statements as part of the planning applications did consider Sizewell. While they didn't consider Sizewell specifically, they did consider an increase in the freight movements along the East Suffolk line. In terms of the considerations, it always looked at the physical distance to the closest part of the residential part of the IGS, which was at least a 30-metre separation distance. As well as the physical nature of it and potential design solutions in terms of how the dwellings would be situated. And at that point, the conclusions of the environmental statements was that there was sufficient mitigation to deal with any, to ensure there was no harm from noise, vibration or air quality as a result of potential increases in the existing railway line, as well as any potential increases as time goes on. We've obviously had some initial conversations with both our environmental health officers and also with Andy Talbot, who's actually on the line today, on the basis that Sizewell is looking at whether there could be increased freight movements. And they have advised that based on DEFRA's technical guidance on moving locomotives, that it's unlikely to change or materially change the conclusions of the environmental statements that were submitted as part of the planning applications. The reason being is the guidance that's in this DEFRA's report is it looks at what's called relevant exposure, which is within 30 metres of identified tracks. And those are tracks which have obviously been identified as potentially causing harm, of which the East Suffolk line is not one of them. And it also looks at criteria of needing to be assessed based on the NO2 concentrations in the background, and again from the advice from our environmental health officer is that Ipswich doesn't have the 25, which is the limit at the moment in Ipswich. The background is much below that, so there's no reason to expect any increase in freight would change the conclusions based on the environmental statements that forms part of the planning applications, and that there's sufficient mitigation to ensure amenities are not harmed.
Thank you. Mrs. Robinson, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something in follow-up to this?
Yes, I did, please. My understanding in answers we had about air quality and noise pollution as well, from the University of Essex, the expert there, suggested that although the traffic on the East Suffolk line and the Felixstowe line is freight and is commercial, the line is regarded as a residential, not an industrial site. It isn't actually measured or evaluated, nor is there a legal requirement to do so. So that's something that needs determining. And we have, again, to go back to the constraints of the road system there. At the point where you've got a level crossing, you've also got two lines that converge at Westfield Station, the East Suffolk line and the Felixstowe line. Any increase or any change to the pattern of freight or traffic on those lines will impact on the level crossing, and you're going to have a school or potentially schools, plural, in the same vicinity, which will attract traffic. And so I think you've got a huge environmental impact area at that level crossing. Potentially, safety is another issue because you're going to have secondary school and primary school there, and inevitably people will get in their cars and take their children to school. So again, in the early years, this is something in this specific site that is major and needs not just estimating and evaluating and projecting, it needs actual data, actual measurement. Network Rail should give some indication of the issues. You've got the cord as well, the work that was to do with that, and obviously environmental health could advise on noise pollution side of things as well. Plus the other issue at that site is the Westfield watercourse, where there is, I think, a tunnel under the rail, and the flooding issue will add to the burden of particular location.
Thank you. And before I come back to the council, Mr. Samuel, I see you have your hand up as well. Did you want to add to those points?
Yes, just very quickly, a couple of our members have raised concerns, specific concerns about the air quality noise impacts on Dale Hall Primary School and the playground, which is next to the railway line. I haven't seen any assessments on that specifically. I don't know if it's worthwhile taking a specific look at that site. The other then issue is in relation to Westerfield Crossing, and the increased time of that the crossing itself will be closed, and therefore the impacts on the traffic and also on the air quality emissions from the traffic in relation to the houses which are immediately next to the road by the crossing. What we would like to see is some form of assessment of that. I don't know if the traffic modelling has actually taken that into account, but it appears not in document D35. Perhaps we could have some clarification on what traffic modelling has been undertaken in relation to Westerfield Crossing, and also not just at peak times, but at the times of entry and exit to the high school. I think that would reassure residents that this has been properly assessed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Evans, should I come to you first, and then if we can go to the County Council, because they may well have something to add to that.
I think there's obviously been a lot of questions raised. I would ask for some sort of steer on where you'd like us to answer, purely because I think some of it's related more to the wider plan and some more on the IGS. Obviously, as part of this query, we're looking at whether, you know, the IGS as an allocation is being fully considered in terms of all of those factors that are being raised. Obviously, the allocation in 2017 provided evidence which looked at all of those matters. And with this review, we've provided more supporting evidence in terms of air quality traffic modelling. In addition to that, we've obviously had environmental statements for the actual applications themselves. And I think some of the queries that are being raised were obviously dealt with as part of the planning applications and the environmental statements that were accompanying those. And obviously all of those conclusions went through the proper means and were considered by consultants, and obviously a recommendation put to planning and planning committee. And obviously air quality was one of those factors which we went into quite a lot of detail. In terms of some of the points that are being raised, I think some obviously may be better answered by Luke Barb from Suffolk County Council on a highways point of view, and we have Andy Talbot from WSP on the line as well, who did the air quality. But in terms of some of the air quality issues, obviously we're looking at walkable communities. We are hoping, you know, we're giving every option for primary schools and secondary schools to be on the site so that people don't have to use their cars. In terms of some of the impacts from the freight side of it, see, the Sizewell's not a commitment at the moment. You know, it's still an unknown. It's now in its 5th round of consultation. So some of it's very difficult to predict. And obviously Sizewell itself in its DCO has provided some preliminary environmental impact information that it will have to assess that particular line, and we'll need to look at obviously the IGS as an allocation. I think that from our side, there's a lot of queries, and it's trying to understand which ones, you know, have already been dealt with under the planning applications and which ones are actually pertinent to the allocation or wider actual modelling for the whole plan.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this session is to focus on the Ipswich Garden suburb, and it is quite difficult sometimes. You know, I've had other examinations where there has been a significant allocation and planning applications which have been approved as while the plan has been going through examination. So it is there are some issues that cross between the two. So I can understand that there is some issues that may well have been answered by the planning application being considered. And others. Mrs. Robinson, sorry, can I just ask you to turn your microphone off? Thank you. So it does lead to some confusion and some duplication in terms of questioning, but I'm satisfied with the questions that you've answered in respect of this site, Mrs. Evans. Perhaps I could just go finally to Mrs. Robinson on this before I go to back to the County Council for their view. Mrs. Robinson, did you want to add anything further?
I do. Unfortunately, the note that we were invited to provide hasn't been on the website when I last looked. But I drew attention to yourselves and to everybody to a really important workshop, the Suffolk Climate Change Emergency Plan Transport and Air Quality Workshop, that happened during the first week of your hearing. And although, sorry, I can't.
Oops, I think you've turned your microphone. There we are.
Sorry, the workshop, and I seem to have a delay or something with this. I hope
it's okay. I can hear you, Mrs. Robinson. Just carry on.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
I know it's always very difficult, and I can appreciate the complexity and the difficulty, but the 2017 planning applications and work done then need to be updated. We've had new legislation, we've had new challenges on air quality, in particular climate change, and it's not good enough from the public perspective to say, well, we've done that in 2017, let's move on and use that as the basis for the arguments now. The climate change policy had some really detailed maps and information that I think justify our concerns over this on this specific site. It may be different on other sites, but this has to be dealt with. I know you're going to be looking at these other matters, but in terms of this site and these set of constraints, it has to be looked at far more carefully and more debate to be had. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just also say, you referred to the note that you've sent into to us, and any sort of additional notes that we've requested and information that has been provided, we will obviously take that all into consideration when we following the hearings, and having heard all of the evidence that has been put to us during the course of the hearings, will of course take into account written responses as well. So just to make that clear, that that will happen, and that will be the sort of the next stage that myself and Mr. Hayden will go through. So thank you for that. Mrs. Evans, did you want to come back on those points, and then we'll go to the County Council finally on this, I think.
Ms. Baker, could I just
sorry,
helpful and say just to Mrs. Robinson, just to give her some reassurance that your statement on the essay that referred to that workshop is on the website. It's actually attached as an addendum to your hearing position statement for the matter one. Yeah, so it is there. And we've seen it, and it's on the website. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you. Mrs. Evans, if I can come to you first, and then we'll go to the County Council if there's anything finally on this.
Of course. Obviously, Mrs. Robinson has made some points, but what I would say is the applications were determined based on the policies, national and local at the point of the decision, as should be done. They were fully assessed on their environmental impacts based on, like I said, what was appropriate at that point. We can't go back and change a planning application that has been determined in I think it was 2018. Obviously it went to committee, and the planning applications were issued in January, and obviously we were considering whether there'd been any changes in legislation at the point of determination. And it should also be noted we've had no judicial review of those planning applications, so they were deemed as acceptable. We'll consider any applications that come forward as we would any application on the IGS or anywhere in Ipswich Borough Council, based on the up-to-date policies and national guidance at that time and the evidence that comes in with it.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. Mr. Cutting, does the County Council wish to say anything further on this matter before we move on?
Ma'am, I've lost Luke Barber, who's having a meter changed. I'm assuming that we're still on question 87.
We are on the impact of Sizewell C, yes.
I referred to our statement that says it would be part of the development consent order determination.
Thank you. That's helpful. If there's nothing further then on this particular question, I'd like to move on finally to main modifications and any proposed changes. And firstly, we've discussed some proposed changes as we've gone through, Mrs. Evans, but are there any other suggested main modifications in relation to the Ipswich Garden suburb which we need to consider as part of this hearing session in your view?
No, Inspector.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have anything further before we close the hearing? No? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your time, and thank you for coming back for the second part of this hearing session. And on that basis, I'll close the hearing, and thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.